Good evening. It's lovely to have you all here. I'm Caroline de Riviere and
I'm Chris.
Christina Bush. So it's lovely to have you coming in now. So we just normally take like just a couple of minutes to let everybody come in and to settle down and for us to witter a little bit. So if you can see chat at the bottom of your screen, it's lovely if you want to pop into chat and say hello and let us know where you're from. That's always nice because we have people coming from all over the world on some of our webinars.
Oh,
thank you.
Thank you.
Thank you, Sharon. That's kind of you. I had a quick brush up after a day's work. Bit of lipstick.
Slapped a bit of licky on, brushed your hair. That's what always works.
Oh, you do, Chris. Always good.
Oh.
So, yeah, you've got a nice comment there, Chris. So, yes, anybody who wants to tell us where they're from, just pop into chat. So, this evening, Christina's going to talk about mental rehearsal. I'm going to learn to speak. And without falling over my words. And you're able to interact with the different people through the chat, but also it'd be lovely if you have questions, if you post them in Q&A, and that way we don't actually sort of lose track of them and we know who we've answered and who we haven't. And we'll be answering questions at the end of Christina's session. We're just going to wait for a couple of more minutes to finally get everybody in. I think we're going to be quite busy tonight, aren't we, Chris?
Oh, I think so.
We've got 40, 50 people coming.
Yeah, I think we have.
Chris, do you want to tell us a little bit about your background before we start?
I will. And I've also got to do a massive big apology because this webinar was scheduled in for about 6 weeks ago. And then suddenly we just sort of cancelled it. And that was due to the fact that I had COVID. So I was quite poorly for a while. So didn't feel up to sort of sharing. So I apologise that this video, this webinar is out of sync with the theme that we were covering 6 weeks ago, which was balance and falls. So I've adapted it slightly to include all aspects of mental rehearsal, rather than what we advertised 6 weeks ago, which was to use mental rehearsal for people who have experienced lots of falls and a lack of confidence. And mental rehearsal was the way in which people could sort of mentally exercise themselves back into full wellness. So big apology. So I'm Chris. My background is...
I don't think I need to.
Well,
you had COVID.
yeah. Well, it did mess a few things up. So my background is I'm a therapist. I'm a talking therapist and a hypnotherapist. So I love using techniques like mental rehearsal with clients. And so that's what we're going to be talking about this evening is how to use mental rehearsal with your clients. So we're going to give a little brief overview of what mental rehearsal is. And then we're going to be sort of deep diving into all the different stages of mental rehearsal. And then we're going to be looking at how to use it with your clients.
So it was Gail's come in. She said she's from Large in Scotland. So welcome, Gail. Anybody else want to tell us where they're from? That would be great. So yes, and I'm actually Caroline de Riviere, and I'm just one of the co-founders of Remote Rehab. And it would be lovely if you join us in the community. I don't know if everybody on here is already community members, but if you're not, I'll give you the address to go to at the end of the webinar or towards the end of the webinar. So it'd be lovely if you could meet us in there and we can continue the conversation.
Beautiful.
So I'm going to share my screen. I'm going to stop my video and mute and share my screen, and then Chris, you can start.
Thank you. Okay, so we just let Caro bring the screen up for a moment. So as I said, we're going to be exploring first of all what mental rehearsal actually is. Now, Caro needs to go back to the beginning. Lovely, thank you. Okay. So, as you can see from the first slide, mental rehearsal is the intentional mental practice of a physical movement or action. Mental rehearsal is used in all sorts of different arenas. So it's used in sports coaching, it's used by musicians, it's used in all sorts of different areas where people want an additional way of practicing. They want to add to the physical practice that they're already doing. And the key thing that's really important, and I think one of the things that I think is really important when we're sort of talking about mental rehearsal with our clients, is to explain why mental rehearsal is such a great addition to physical practice. So first of all, if you can't do something at the moment, then it's a great way of practicing something which physically you're incapable of doing. And I know those of you who've come on our webinars before, you've heard me talk about a guy called Joe Dispenza, who is a real sort of expert in the field of using your brain for a change. And he's written countless books and he runs all sorts of exciting and interesting programs. And his journey with using practices like mental rehearsal started when he had an accident himself. And he damaged his spine and he was unable to move for, I think it was something around 3 to 4 months. During that time, he used mental rehearsal as one of the core practices to support him in his healing. The diagnosis he was given was you're never going to walk properly again. You're going to need surgery. You're going to have long-lasting damage and pain. And just over 3 months after he received that diagnosis, he got up out of bed and has had no pain and didn't require surgery. And he healed his body absolutely and completely by using, amongst other things, mental rehearsal practice. So the important thing, as you can see, I've got images, sounds and feelings on this slide. What's really key to mental rehearsal is it isn't just about, and lots of people when they talk about it go, oh, it's just about imagining yourself doing something a few times a day. You know, it's sort of running a movie in your head and going, oh, I can imagine myself getting up. Isn't that great? And that's going to make the difference. It's actually not going to make the difference because mental rehearsal requires you to utilize all of your senses. So it requires you and it requires practice. And we're going to be talking about that a little bit later on in terms of how to support a patient to develop the practice of mental rehearsal. So the first thing that's really important is we really want to ramp up the images. So it's not just about sort of imagining yourself walking, it's associating into your movements and heightening the images that you're using. So bringing colour and vibrancy to those images. Now, a few weeks ago, we did a webinar, I don't know if any of you came along to that, on learning styles, and we looked at how important it is, if you are visual, to really be able to as I said, ramp up those images. And in mental rehearsal, that's absolutely crucial because the more that you can get your brain to associate into that mental image, the more effective this practice is going to be. So the first thing is about using images. The second is really tuning into sounds. Now, some people I've worked with say, I really struggle to hear sounds and to imagine sounds. I really struggle to do that. So what I always encourage people to do is to start by just noticing and paying attention to their breathing as they're actually doing their mental rehearsal. So they're starting to really notice and pay attention to the sounds that are going on in their bodies, and therefore they're also able to practice just listening to sounds outside of their bodies as well. So it's about bringing in images, it's about bringing in sounds, and I've called this third one feelings, but what we're really talking about here is we're not just talking about feelings, we're talking about sensations. So I'm sure all of you have experienced a time when you've had a thought about something, and as you've been thinking about it, the longer that you think about it, the more your body responds to those thoughts. So, for example, imagine I'm about to have a meeting in about an hour or so's time, and I'm really uncomfortable about that meeting, and I start to play out what's going to happen at that meeting. And as I start to run those thoughts through my mind, what then happens, and my images start to get brighter and more focused, and I might, for example, start hearing the sounds in the room, and I might start hearing the sounds of people's voices. What happens is my body responds as if I was actually in that room. And so I start to experience potentially butterflies in my tummy. I start to maybe experience a sensation of shaking. Sometimes I can experience a feeling of a sort of a headache. And I can start to feel anxious. So what we're talking about here is using what our bodies are already doing, but in a focused way and in an intentional way and in a repetitive way. So the things that we would do unconsciously, like run a movie of a meeting, we're now intentionally and consciously running a mental practice around our movements and around our healing. So, Carol, do you want to just flip to the next slide, please? Thank you. So what does mental rehearsal do? I think one of the key things that's really important when you're working with clients around mental rehearsal is to really help them to understand why it's so important and why it works. Now, a lot of clients don't really necessarily connect into the word self-directed neuroplasticity. But when we can explain what that means to our clients, my experience, and I know those people who work with mental rehearsal regularly, their clients absolutely buy into it once they understand that what they're in effect doing is rewiring their brains. Now, I'm not going to go into a load of detail about our brains tonight, because actually we haven't got time, and it's quite a sort of a detailed explanation. But what we will be doing in January is we're going to be running a series of paid webinars and courses. And one of the programs that we're going to be running is an introduction to our amazing brains. And we'll be looking at how to share with our clients how our brains work. So it's in effect, it's a client's tour of their brains. One of the things I always say is if you're working with a client using mental rehearsal, it's important that you explain how the brain works. And it's important that your clients understand this concept of neuroplasticity and the fact that if we repeat something over and over and over again, we can actually change our neural pathways, and we can in fact rewire our brains and heal our bodies. So having a sort of an explanation of that. So come along to our webinar, of course, in January, or get yourself if you haven't already got one, get yourself a really good book on neuroscience, so that you're really able, if you're going to be using mental rehearsal, you're really able to explain it clearly in the context of how our brains work. Okay, Caro, do you want to take the next slide? Thanks. Okay. One of the things that I think is really important is also just explaining not only how our brains work, but also how our central and peripheral nervous systems work. And this ability that what we're really doing through mental rehearsal is we're sending messages and receiving messages around our bodies. So what we're in effect doing is, if we start to get our patients or our clients to really understand that thoughts are in fact messages which run around our bodies, and as those messages run around their bodies, so our bodies respond to the information that they're actually receiving. So, as I said, get yourself a really good neuroscience book and have some really beautiful images and explanations. And I would also encourage you, as well, as we go further down through this presentation, is also to get a really good anatomy book, because mental rehearsal, one of the key things that our clients need in mental rehearsal is they need to understand how their bodies work. And if I go back to Joe Dispenza's example, one of the things that Joe had was, because he was a chiropractor, training to be a chiropractor, he actually had a really deep understanding of his spine. And so when he was doing his imagining and he was doing his mental rehearsal practice, he knew exactly what his spine should look like. And he was able, therefore, to start sending messages around his body, telling his body how his spine needed to be. And of course, as our spines and our bodies receive those messages, so the body responds to those that information. Okay, so just want to move on to, so we've started with the concepts that in order for our clients to really buy into mental rehearsal, they need to understand how the brains work and how the central nervous system or the communication system works. Carol, do you want to go to the next slide? Thank you. They also need to understand something which I think is really key, is that behaviours are habits. And I love this particular quote from Samuel Johnson. The chains of habit are too weak to be felt until they are too strong to be broken. So the key thing with habits is they're out of our awareness. Because our brains just could not process all that information about having to think about exactly, well, how do I do this? How do I do this? And we don't want to keep engaging our decision-making part of our brains to continue to think about, well, how should I stand up? What should I do? And how should I move? So much of what we do is unconscious and out of our awareness, and therefore it becomes a habit. And I suppose those of you who have ever tried to change a habit know that it can actually be quite hard work, and habits take a long time, particularly if they're habits that we really are not, absolutely have no understanding of. So and what we're going to be looking at in a minute is we're going to be looking at how we break down those habits, those behaviours, so that we can really start to pay attention to how we want things to change. And so that's why athletes use mental rehearsal so much in their training, or the top class athletes do, because what they use it for is to fine tune specific movements. So footballers, and back to the whole muscle memory, will rehearse and rehearse and rehearse in their minds how they're going to actually kick the ball, so that when it comes to the time when they're actually on the field, they don't have to think about, or their body knows exactly what to do, because it's been practicing it for such a long time. So for clients to understand that behaviours are habits, and what we're in effect doing is we're changing a set of habits through the process of mental rehearsal. So Cara, do you want to go to the next slide, please? Thank you. So every unconscious behaviour is an unconscious habit, and it can take up to between 40 and 60 days to embed a new habit. So in order for a patient and a client to change a habit, they need to really understand and go through the mental rehearsal process. And as I've already said, mental rehearsal is the same as physical practice if utilised effectively. So if we work, I'm going to just take you through the mental rehearsal process in a second. But the important thing is it takes time to learn how to use the mental rehearsal process. So I would expect, if I was working with a client, to be working with them for about 2 or 3 weeks on a sort of regular basis, helping them to practice all of the elements of mental rehearsal before we were confident that they could practice it on their own right the way through from beginning to end. Because if you imagine, mental rehearsal is very much like a meditation, and if anybody's ever learnt transcendental meditation, you know that there are so many elements to it that it takes time to learn those individual elements before putting it together into a practice. And mental rehearsal is exactly the same. We're learning individual elements, pulling those elements together, and then using them as a daily practice. So let's have a look at the elements then of mental rehearsal. Do you want to do the next slide, please, Cara? Thanks. Okay, so if we just flick to the first thing, unconscious movement. As we've already said, the vast majority of things we do physically are out of our awareness. They're unconscious movement. So the first step in the mental rehearsal process is, if you just flick on the next one for me, slide, Cara, thanks, is conscious awareness. And we're going to deep dive into conscious awareness in a minute. But what we're inviting our clients to do is to become aware of how they are currently moving. And when I say how, I mean the fullness of their awareness. So it's about the sensations, it's about the sequencing. You're bringing everything that you want to work on into a conscious awareness. So if we take the example of a footballer, what we're doing is we're really they will be concentrating on their body position, they'll be concentrating on the sensations of movement, they'll be concentrating on the muscle groups, they'll be concentrating on everything that makes up that movement, so that the movement goes from being an unconscious movement into a conscious movement, and we are then able to notice what we notice and become aware of what we become aware of. You can go to the next one then, Cara, please. Thanks. Now what we're able to do is, only when we have a deep understanding of what is, can we move on to imagining what we want things to be like. So what we're now able to do is, once we have really connected into this consciousness of movement, we can then start to say, okay, so now how do I want my movements to become, and what needs tweaking? And so what we can then start to do is to build in into our practice an imagined movement. And anybody who's ever used mental rehearsal before, once we get to this stage, what's fascinating is we may be concentrating, for example, I might be concentrating on my toe and imagining that my toes can separate. What's incredible is that when you look down and you notice, our toes actually start to vibrate, and we can even begin to see very, very tiny movements in response to the imagined movements. But we're going to talk a little bit about how we ramp up the imagined experience to ensure that our body actually responds to that imagined movement. You can do the next slide, next one, thank you. So once we've kind of started to imagine movement, what we're then going to add in is what we call conscious connection. And what that is about actually starting to bring in our breathing. It's starting to bring in potentially a mantra, or some self-talk, or some things which help us and help us to associate even more into the movement. So some people, and what going back to the example of footballers, I know a guy I was talking to years ago, he would actually say that, you know, when he was practicing and he was imagining, he would really start with the imagined movement. And then as he was really starting to step into and really experience that imagined movement, he might add in, you're so successful. This is how, you know, you're always achieving, you're always scoring goals. This is absolutely so natural to you and just perfect. So he would add in all of the words and an associated way of connecting into that particular movement. And the next one, Caro. And then we start to move. So once you've actually been practicing, mentally practicing, the next step is to move that mental practice into conscious movement. And lots of people say, well, why can't you just go from the sort of imagined movement and conscious connection into unconscious movement? The reason we don't do that is because we really want to continue with this consciousness so that we can continue to keep tweaking and keep noticing what we notice, because we might, as we consciously move, begin to notice actually there's probably a little bit more imagined movement that I need to make before I can really step away from paying attention to this movement. So we move from unconscious movement into conscious awareness, into imagined movement, into conscious connection, and into conscious movement, which is, and what we often call this, is the sort of the mental rehearsal process. Okay, so let's now deep dive into, so I'm going to leave unconscious movement until the end, bizarrely, and start with conscious awareness. So if we just move to the next slide, Caro, thanks. So conscious awareness has two elements to it. it has the actual bodily sensation. As you can see from one of the photos, you've got a woman who's actually got her hands on her foot. So what we're doing in the first instance with conscious awareness is we are inviting it, and if the person has the flexibility and the physical ability to do this, is to actually not only feel their foot in the sense of connecting into their foot, but also, as you can see with her hands, she's also feeling her foot. And that touch is really important. What I've always experienced with so many of the clients that I've worked with is that the vast majority of clients don't actually really touch themselves very often. So they're not even necessarily aware of how their foot feels. So they're not aware of the tension in their foot. So they're not aware of feeling the tension in their foot, as in experiencing it in their foot, but they're also not aware of what it feels like when they touch their foot and feel that tension. So conscious awareness is a beautiful, I describe it as a very sort of sacred process where we're inviting our clients to truly physically connect with their bodies. And we're inviting them to notice what they notice as they're literally feeling their foot, in the sense of touching their foot, what they notice, and what they notice about the changes that take place when they are actually in contact, touching their foot. We're also inviting them to really begin to notice where the tension is, the pain is, how flexible their foot is, or the part of their body, the range of movement that they have, and what is possible. And I remember when I was, I damaged my, we're talking about feet here, but I damaged my leg a number of years ago and worked with an incredible Pilates teacher who was just amazing. And that's where I really learned personally the power of really massaging and touching and connecting into, in my case, my leg, and noticing how my body was responding to my touch and how different it was from the touch of my therapist. And just noticing what we notice, and also encouraging us not to touch it in a way of, oh, I'm just going to have to touch my leg or my foot, but to touch with real love. Because again, what we're doing is we're encouraging our clients to really connect into positive emotions, what we want them to be experiencing. So when they're touching their foot, what we want them to experience is real love and real connection and care for their bodies, rather than annoyance at, oh my gosh, my body's letting me down, I'm so angry, but actually to begin to really accept their bodies and honour their bodies. So the first, as you can see, the first image is the physical touch. The second is, as you can see, it's a diagram of the foot. So obviously, and I'm stating the obvious, but we can only see certain amount of our, in this case, our foot. So one that's really important is to have anatomy diagrams. I know many of you use anatomy diagrams all the time. And this is the opportunity, as we start to work with our clients, is to take the image and start them to embody that image and start to imagine their own foot. So an example I've talked often about, my bunion. One of the things that I did a lot of work in personally was to really imagine my toe straight. And I used the mental rehearsal process to straighten my toe. But I really needed to deeply understand how my foot, the bones and the ligaments and the muscles in my foot worked. And what's incredible is, as soon as we have that, for some of us, we have that understanding, we can translate that understanding into actually our imaginations and our ability to move. So conscious awareness is a physical, emotional, and thinking and logical awareness of what's actually going on right here, right now. Thank you, Cara. Do you want to move on? Thank you. So now, once we've got this conscious awareness, we can move on to the first stage of creation, which is imagined movement. the first thing that's really important is that we associate into the experience. So earlier when I was sort of talking about, I can imagine myself going on holiday, and it's a very sort of general image. I can imagine myself at the airport, imagine the sounds around me, but I'm not actually associating into my own experience of standing in that airport and what it feels like in my body. So what we're doing with mental rehearsal is we're using our imaginations to associate into our physical experiences. So I've learned about my foot. I've learned about how my foot feels right now. And so what I'm now going to do is take that knowledge and understanding and begin to imagine how I want to move my foot in the future. So, and I'm associating into that. So I'm really connecting into, and some people describe it as sort of going on a bit of a tour around their bodies. They go, so if you saw the film years ago when everybody, it was a sort of lovely little film where you went around the body's bloodstream. That, well, there's this sense of being able to go down and into my body and imagine myself and imagine my foot and imagine the sensations in my foot and start to imagine myself moving in a way that potentially I'm not able to do at the moment. The importance, we talked earlier on about building up this layered movie. And that's about really building up the sensations. And that's why it takes practice, because it takes practice for us to get used to consciously imagining. We all imagine all the time, but we're not necessarily conscious of how we are imagining. What we are conscious of is the results that we experience after the imagining. So we're back to the example that I gave you about going to a meeting. I'm really worried about it. I don't become conscious of the thoughts that I'm thinking necessarily about that particular meeting. But what I do become conscious of is that I'm starting to sweat. I'm really starting to feel nervous. And for most people, they kind of haven't really made the connection between feeling nervous and their thought patterns. And if they do make that connection, they say, oh, I can't really help it. It's out of my control. What we're doing here is using that natural process that we are all able to do consciously. And we're doing exactly what I would do if I was worrying about my meeting, which is building up the layers. So we're building up the visuals, we're building up the auditory, and we're building up the sensations. It's also important to, when we're doing mental rehearsal with the physical, is to teach our clients how to do little movements first and then bring all those movements together. So it might be that we start by just really taking a lovely deep breath, getting used to really deeply breathing, and then consciously paying attention to our big toe, for example, and just literally getting used to imagining ourselves actually just moving a little bit our big toe, just slightly. Once I've got the hang of that, I might then want to be able to move on to the second toe, the third toe, the fourth toe, and then move. So it's a process of moving through the body and then linking small movements and connecting them together into the full movement. So it's the ability to, and as we do that, the reason why we do it in such minute stages is because we can tweak. And we can get people to just come back to, okay, so let's just go back to that movement. So when they come to conscious movement and then they want to go back to imagined, they know which bit they want to tweak. Okay, Carol, do you want to move to the next one, please? Thank you. Okay, so we've started by becoming aware. So we're going to carry on just using the analogy of the foot. Now this guy's now learning to stand up on putting weight onto his foot. We started off by becoming aware of how our foot works. We started to understand the structures in our foot. We've started to develop the movement. And in this particular case, what this guy's doing is he is doing some kind of movement, but he's also practicing breathing and word association. So what we're doing here in this particular section is we're adding in, so we're still running the movie, and we're not consciously making all of the movements. But what we're doing here is we're running the movie and we're actually starting to add in the breathing, the word association, the emotional triggers, and the state management. And the whole idea of doing this is really to start to bring up all of the feelings that we want to experience when we're moving. So just as we talked about earlier on about the meeting and getting ready for a meeting, and how we start to experience those feelings, as soon as we start to run the movie, we also want to start to layer in or connect into the emotions and the feelings and the sensations that we experience as we're making that movement. I've talked a little bit about word association. The word association is really useful as well, because it's just as we've got emotional triggers, we've got sort of words that can trigger the emotions. So it's really useful to have lots of conversations with our clients to just understand the words that they want to be saying to themselves, the intonation that they want to be using in their head, and really helping them to really use their breathing to develop a really relaxed and joyful sort of state where they're finding their movements really easy, they're getting pleasure out of movement, and they're really starting to connect into the freedom and the joy that movement brings. Okay, so do you want to move into the next one? Now we're into conscious movement. So once we've been practicing unconscious, we've been practicing awareness, and we've been running the movie, and we've been adding in conscious connection, it's worth us beginning to practice the actual movements themselves. And what you'll notice here is, as I'm sure you can notice, is the foot's still slightly out of alignment. So what this gives us the opportunity to do is, when we start to bring conscious movement in, is we start to learn where we need to tweak. So we've been practicing, and now we're bringing in mentally practicing, and now we're bringing in conscious movement. So we're starting to pay attention to the experience. We're connecting to the sensations, we're noticing what we're noticing, and we're keeping some records about this so that we can go, when we go back into the mental rehearsal, we can start to make the tweaks. So we can start to, okay, I do need to pay more attention to my ankle. I need to start, because what I'm noticing is that whilst my toes are moving more freely, I'm still I'm still moving over here. I can still feel tension in my ankle, or I can still feel this happening. So I'm now going to go back into my mental rehearsal process and start to make those tweaks. So noticing what you notice and staying on it is really, really important. Okay, do you want to go to the next slide, Caro? So once we've been practicing this for a while, we can start to really, really settle into this, starting to really become unconscious movement. So that's when our new movements are habits and the new norm, and they're out of awareness, and we're unaware of the physical sensations. So now we're moving. Again, we can sort of take our attention off it, and now we know that we've done all the work that we need to do. Now we can actually start to put that movement into our unconscious minds and just relax into moving without even thinking. So I just want to go through now, if we go to the next slide, Caro, we just want to go through the practice. So how do we help a patient or a client develop a mental rehearsal practice? So the first thing I want to talk about is there's a sort of a start, a middle, and an end to the practice. So it's really important that we set out the practice before we start breaking the practice down into the different elements. So if I'm teaching a client mental rehearsal, I'll start by explaining about how their brain works and why mental rehearsal is so important. I'll then explain to them the process, if you like. So I'll explain to them how important it is that they take the time and how much time to actually take. So I'll say, okay, so on average, I'd be inviting somebody who is building a mental rehearsal practice into their daily exercise and activity routines to be spending between 15 and 30 minutes doing their mental rehearsal practice. So that's what we're going to be building up to. We're going to be building up to between 15 and 30 minutes. Now, a lot of the clients that I have worked with over the years will actually do a number of those practices throughout the day. Because as they start to get used to the practice and they become familiar with it and comfortable with it, my experience is that they're really keen to just keep practicing it, because not only are they practicing a particular movement that they really want to be able to develop, but they're also having between 15 and 30 minutes of relaxation time as well. So they're having an opportunity to just switch off and to just really go into themselves and to have a really lovely sort of healing space. So my experience is that actually, you know, for most clients, they'll usually do a practice in the morning, maybe do one around lunchtime, and then do another one in the evening. Because when clients really buy into this, they see this as exactly the same way as they see doing an exercise, a physical exercise. It's the same thing. And so because they've got really clear goals and they want to be moving and they want to be free, they will actually put the work in. So I start by, as I said, explaining how the brain works, their brains work. I explain the whole sort of communication process, and I explain the mental rehearsal process. So I usually start by teaching my clients breathing, because for so many clients, they're really how they breathe and the way that they breathe is completely out of their awareness. So I start teaching them by just really helping them to connect into how they breathe and giving them and teaching them a number of different breathing practices, so that when we start to move on to movement, or imagining movement, they've already got a really beautiful breathing practice. Now, there's lots and lots of different breathing practices that I know I'm sure you guys all use. But the one that I particularly use with mental rehearsal is to move on the out breath. So I just teach my clients how to breathe in, how to hold their breath, and then how to imagine movement as they're breathing out. But there are lots and lots of different breathing techniques that you can use with clients. So my starting point is always the breath, and my finish point is always the breath. And I know Caro, when Caro talks about breathing and meditation, she always talks about there is only the breath. And for me, I think that's really, really important in this mental rehearsal process, because the breathing brings relaxation, and it brings an energy into the body, which is really, really important. So I start with breathing, and then I'll also move on to helping the clients to use their imagination. Now, depending on whether they've done visualizations before, if they've done meditations, or what their experience is, will determine how much time I spend and how I go about supporting clients to learn how to visualize. But I'll spend a lot of time. So I'll encourage them to just become aware of when they are imagining something, how they imagine it. So do they hear sounds? How do they experience the sensations? How do they experience the images? Are they bright? Are they dull? Do they experience them moving or still? So I really invite my clients to become really comfortable and familiar with how they actually use their imagination. And so that can, and I'll often teach them some lovely little visualization practices So they can just get really, really comfortable with using their imagination. And then I will link the breathing to their imagination. So they're then able to really utilize and connect the breathing and the images. And we practice that until they're really comfortable with that. Then we kind of put that to one side. And what I'll then do is I'll move into a sort of a teaching process where we'll then move into that sort of connection and awareness with their body. So I've got a number of practices that I use around touch and around sensation, so that clients really become comfortable engaging with their bodies. And as I've said earlier on, many of the clients that I've worked with are very uncomfortable about touching their bodies because they've got all sorts of, particularly if they feel their bodies let them down, they've got all sorts of beliefs and feelings about their body that they can really sometimes really struggle with that connection. So I use a number of different practices to help them to really start to experience the sensations in their bodies. And I'll also, at this point, help them understand from an anatomy perspective how their body's actually working. So we're doing two things here. We're physically connecting, and we're also going, okay, so when my finger moves in that particular way, that's what's actually moving in your body. So these are the muscles, these are the ligaments, this is the structure that's happening when you're actually making that particular movement. So, and that can be, that can take a short period of time or a long period of time, depending on how much the client wants to know. And I use some great books that you can use. There's a great book on yoga anatomy, which has got some really, really lovely diagrams around movement, so you can actually see how the body moves. And there's also some lovely anatomy books around Pilates as well. So, and I use those because more than sort of medical anatomy books, because people can relate to yoga and Pilates movement probably more easily than they can do to a sort of a medical anatomy book. So they've learnt their breathing techniques. They've really become comfortable and connected to how they imagine and use their imagination. They've started to really connect into and become aware of the physical sensations in their bodies and how their bodies are moving. And then we start moving into breaking down the practice of imagined movement. And so we combine the breathing with the mental rehearsal of how they're going to actually move their bodies. And I think that again is really dependent upon how quickly somebody really connects into this particular practice. So I probably, on average, will get my clients to practice that a few times a day, rather than going straight into a 15-minute practice. So I'd get them to practice all the individual elements. So they might do a bit of breathing, stop. They might do some touch and some connection. They might then do a very short mental rehearsal of movement, and those might have I don't know, gaps between them, so that they're just getting used to practicing. And then we then start to build in, as I've said, the affirmations and the self-talk. So I've now got a breathing, I've got my connection, and I'm aware of how my body is. I've started to practice some of the movements, and some people love to, as we've already talked about, add in some words. And people also might even want to add in some music. I know some people want to use music, others don't. I don't have a particular preference. I think what's really important is, if you're going to use music, you're imagining moving to the music. So the rhythm of the music is actually determining how you're actually moving. And I think that's really, really important. So we've got self-talk, we've got mantras, and we've got affirmations. And then very slowly, as clients start to build up the experience of all those different elements, we start to put them together into a 5-minute practice, a 10-minute practice, working up to a 30-minute practice, so that the clients get the opportunity to really notice the progress that they're making, and to give themselves more and more and more time to spend just really enjoying the experience of this practice. And as I've said, the next sort of stage for me, the sort of the middle bit, I suppose, is for them to start introducing, if that's possible, conscious movement in as well. So I've now got my mental rehearsal practice, and I've got my 15 minutes of mental rehearsal practice. And now I'm going to build in my conscious movement practice, notice what I notice, and then feed back into my mental rehearsal practice all the things that I'm noticing as I'm actually moving. And then I really also encourage my clients not only to do a breathing exercise at the beginning, but also as they start to really develop, is I'll often actually invite them to introduce a breathing practice at the end of the work they do around mental rehearsal, and just encourage them to really build in some sort of relaxation time, so that they've got time also, because their minds have been working really active. It's also a time just to sort of really gently come down from that activity and just to relax. So that's how I do it. And I know lots of other people use all sorts of other sort of ways of supporting their clients, but that's how I do it. Now, I get lots and lots of questions from people who say, well, what happens if somebody has challenges, learning difficulties, or other sort of challenges? Can you still use mental rehearsal? Yes, my answer is yes, you can. You're just using it in a very different, you're doing a different setup, and you might have to change the way that you actually explain things. But my belief is that there is some aspect of this whole process that you can use with clients at all different sort of stages. So I'm very conscious of time, and I want to take some questions and just to catch up on anything else that anybody wants to talk about. So I'm going to stop now, Caro. And I don't know whether are you going to quickly whiz through that before we take questions?
Hello.
Or okay.
Yes, I'm back.
Hello.
I'm always amazed when the technology works. So yes, I just first of all, thank you, Chris. That was fascinating and very comprehensive, and you can talk for England. That was amazing.
Yeah, I think we know that.
No, it was great. It was really, really good, and lots of really useful information. And I love the way that you broke it all down into easy to digest sections. So we have got a question from Amy Regan, which I just need to move over. But before we go to questions, I just wanted to encourage everybody, if you're not already a member of our community, if you go to this, I don't know if you can see my little pointer thing, but rrcommunity.life, which is the middle icon down the bottom. If you pop over, you can join our community for free, which is great news, and come in and continue the conversation with us. That would be lovely if you do that. You just need to, it's a private community, you just need to apply, and then you just put in there's some questions which you need to answer, just so we know who you are and where you're from, and then we'll welcome you in. So let's go to, I'm going to stop screen sharing.
Lovely. So Amy, I've just called up your question. Thank you. So your question is, what would you suggest for somebody whose sensation is affected following an injury, example, spinal cord injury? So when I work with people who have lost sensation, in that particular part of the body, I will often get them to imagine a time when they had got the sensation. So because we're working with imagination, we can wave a magic wand and have all sorts of amazing things happen. So one of the things that I would do with the client would be to invite them to connect into their spinal cord and to begin to imagine the sensation. So they're making it up, they're creating it, which is in effect what we're doing with the whole mental rehearsal process. So I'll often invite them to remember a time when they could feel something, and when they could, what did it feel like? And I kind of don't much care whether it's actually what they really felt or not, because what we're doing here is we're doing an imagining process anyway. So what we're doing is inviting them to imagine how something actually is going to feel in the future. So the fact that I haven't got any sensation now, what I'm going to do is start to imagine how I want my sensations to experience, how I want to experience sensations in the future. I don't know whether that answers your question, Amy, but if it doesn't, then jot down some more. Great. So
is there any other questions for Chris? I know you were very comprehensive the way you covered everything. I think that's sometimes
wait a moment.
Amy's just saying thank you, very helpful. Thank you.
Oh, okay.
And I think, Chris, it's interesting, isn't it, about mental rehearsal, and also about, there was one thing I was thinking about towards the end of your presentation, was that sometimes when we do mental rehearsal, I know my own personal experience has been, when I went through something many years ago, was that as I started the mental rehearsal, other images came into my mind, and actually and colours and things like this, and actually when I ran with it and didn't fight it, when I allowed those things, and suddenly I went in. I remember once when I went into this sort of imagery of walking down this path, so it was almost like a guided meditation, but it happened spontaneously, and along this path I was sort of meeting things that were stress factors. And what I realized afterwards was I had a real release of stress. And so it's also, I think, important, isn't it, to allow space for the emotions to come out, because obviously if you're damaged and you're trying to get back, the emotions play such a huge factor, don't they, in your healing. And sometimes that imagery can just turn into metaphors and all sorts of lovely things.
And that's why I think it's really important to really keep checking in with you. So in the beginning process of your client really learning how to do mental rehearsal, it's really important to keep checking in, and it's really important to to be practicing. So I just use Zoom, or in fact actually I often just do, once I'm used to working with somebody, I'll even do it over the phone. So I think, we just need to be able to check in with them regularly and just make sure that it's okay. And also just really reassure people, because so many people say to me, well, I can't really see anything. And it's like, no, it's because I think sometimes people imagine that when you say you're going to run a movie, you really are going to, when they consciously think about using imagination, I must be able to see something. I must be able to see a full technicolor, glorious sort of, like I'm watching the telly. And it's like, no, it isn't actually like that. It's for some people, it can be very vivid, but for other people,
but sometimes people find it difficult. There's another question, Chris.
Right.
From Rosemary. Is mental rehearsal useful at any stage of stroke recovery?
Yeah, I would start as soon as your client is able to start doing any sort of exercise or doing any activity, I'd start with mental rehearsal, because all we're doing all the time is really, it's a beautiful way to really enable a client, as I said earlier, to sort of relax and to learn their breathing. So I would start with their breathing. I'd start with them just very, very gently beginning to imagine themselves getting out of bed. all sorts of things like that, and then starting to take that sort of general imagining and then starting to really hone it down into very specific movements. My sadness, I have to say, is that there's not a huge amount of research around the impact of mental rehearsal on stroke. But if any of you guys want to come into our community and start that research, I get massively excited. And I know Sharon as well. And I know Sharon and Liana would as well.
Just sorry to interrupt, but because it's getting late, Gail is saying, yeah, thank you very much. Enjoyed the presentation. Can you recommend a place to read best evidence base for this? And I was just going to say, well, come into the community.
Yeah, and there's lots of great work out there. I would recommend, if you want to read a book that's really great about mental rehearsal, get into Joe Dispenza's work. And if you've got an Amazon Prime membership, then you can access Gaia TV. It does have a lot of spiritual stuff on there. So if that's not your thing, then just move on from that. But what it does have is a brilliant series by Joe Dispenza called Rewired, which absolutely explains the ins and outs of what I've been talking about for the last hour around how to use. He doesn't call it mental rehearsal. Specifically, he calls it self-directed neuroplasticity, but what he's really talking about, one of the elements, is mental rehearsal, and he also then combines it with meditation. So if you are up for doing that, that would be amazing. And also just have a look around. You'll get much more evidence of mental rehearsal from the world of sport and the world of music, where orchestras use it a huge amount in actually getting people to practice very, very tiny movements. Particularly violinists use it a lot. So there's lots of good evidence of that. But sadly, not much evidence, clinical evidence, which is a bugbear of mine. So if anybody wants to come and do some research with me, I'd be delighted to work with you.
Thank you. Thank you so much, Chris. And thank you to everybody for coming.